The gunshot didn't echo the way people expected. It cracked the air sharp and final, like a judge's gavel slamming down on history itself. On a gray Harlem morning, when the sidewalks still held last night's rain and the city thought it understood who was allowed to speak and who was meant to stay silent, Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard fired one shot. Not into a crowd, not in panic, not in rage. He fired it as a message. Every man standing there understood it instantly. The police froze first. That was the part no one forgot. Uniforms stiffened. Hidiwar's hands stopped mid-motion. One officer had been reaching for his baton. He never finished. Another had his mouth open halfway into a command that suddenly felt foolish. The street, usually loud with engines and voices, went quiet enough to hear the wind push paper down the curb. And at the center of it all stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't even turn his head toward the fallen man bleeding out near the fire hydrant. Bumpy Johnson simply exhaled smoke from his cigarette and stared at the police captain like a teacher waiting for a slow student to catch up. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't chaos. This was order being renegotiated in real time. Moments earlier, the captain had arrived loud and confident, barking commands, calling men boys, promising arrests, promising force. He believed the badge spoke louder than reputation. He believed the street would fold the way it always had. But Harlem didn't fold that morning. Because when Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard fired, history listened, and Harlem remembered. Long before that morning, before the sirens, before the shot, before the silence, Bumpy Johnson had already become something more than a man. He was a constant presence in Harlem, as familiar as the brownstones and as unavoidable as the questions nobody else dared to answer. He walked with a limp from an old fight that had never healed right, his head tilted slightly to one side, eyes always moving. People said he saw everything. Some said he remembered everything too. Names, debts, slights, favors, promises. In the 1930s and 40s, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a battleground of influence. Politicians wanted votes without responsibility. Police wanted control without respect. White mobsters wanted profit without consequence. And the community wanted what it had always wanted: dignity. Bumpy Johnson understood all of that. He wasn't born powerful. He was born observant. He learned early that violence without purpose was just noise, but violence with timing could become language. And he learned that respect, once taken, could never be begged back. By the time most men knew his name, Bumpy already controlled the flow of Harlem's underground economy: gambling, numbers, protection. But he also controlled something more dangerous: restraint. He didn't allow random bloodshed. He didn't tolerate disrespect toward women, elders, or children, and he never let outsiders forget that Harlem was not an open field. It was governed. That balance was why people listened when Bumpy spoke, and why men stood a little straighter when he entered a room. And it was why he needed bodyguards, not thugs, not bullies, soldiers, men who understood that they weren't protecting just a man, but a principle, men who knew when to keep their hands at their sides and when to raise them without hesitation. One of those men stood at Bumpy's shoulder that morning. His name didn't matter as much as his reputation. He was quiet, former military, eyes trained forward, posture disciplined, fingers steady. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and when he did, people listened because they knew he measured words the same way he measured distance. He had been told one thing by Bumpy Johnson long before that day: "You don't fire unless I stop talking." That morning, Bumpy hadn't stopped talking, but the police captain had. The captain was new to Harlem. That was his first mistake. He'd been sent uptown to make a statement, to show that the department was tired of letting one man dictate the rules. He brought extra patrol cars, extra men, extra confidence. He didn't bring understanding. He arrived outside a popular numbers house just after dawn, kicked in the door, and dragged two runners into the street. He did it loudly, theatrically, making sure windows were open and eyes were watching. When Bumpy Johnson appeared at the corner, calm as Sunday morning, the captain smiled. This was the confrontation he'd been waiting for. "You're interfering with police business," the captain said, voice sharp, chest out. You and your boys better step back. Bumpy looked at the two runners on the ground. Young men, scared, alive. Then he looked at the captain. You came into my neighborhood early, Bumpy said evenly. That tells me you wanted witnesses. The captain scoffed. What I want is order. Bumpy nodded slowly. Then you should have asked. The captain laughed. And then, loud enough for the whole block to hear, he said the word that would change everything. Boy! The bodyguard shifted his weight. Bumpy raised one finger, not at the police, but slightly downward. A signal meant for only one man. The captain kept talking. Threats, arrests, promises of jail cells and headlines. He never saw the bodyguard raise the weapon. The shot came between syllables. And when the echo faded, Harlem learned something the rest of the city would spend years trying to understand. Authority only works when someone believes in it. Bumpy Johnson believed in balance, and he was about to teach the city what happened when that balance was ignored. The man who fell wasn't the police captain. That detail mattered. He was a patrolman, young, eager, standing 2 steps too far forward with a nightstick raised like he was about to make a name for himself. When the bullet caught him high in the shoulder and spun him sideways into the hydrant, the lesson was immediate and unmistakable. This wasn't an execution. This was a warning delivered with precision. The captain's face drained of color as the reality settled in. This wasn't chaos he could command with a whistle and a report. This was a situation where every next word could decide whether men went home alive or not at all. Bumpy Johnson finally turned his head. Slow, deliberate. He looked at the wounded officer first, then at the bodyguard, and finally back at the captain. His voice never rose. That was the part that carried weight. You came here loud, Bumpy said. You disrespected this street, and now one of your men is hurt. The captain swallowed hard. You just shot a police officer. Bumpy nodded once. Your man stepped where he shouldn't have. That was it. No apology, no threat. Just a statement of fact. The surrounding officers tightened their formation out of instinct, hands moving toward weapons they suddenly weren't sure they should draw. They'd trained for shootouts. They'd trained for riots. They hadn't trained for a man who refused to escalate. Bumpy took a step forward. The bodyguard mirrored him, half a pace behind, gun still raised, but lowered just enough to signal control. You arrest my runners, Bumpy continued. You make your point. That's your job. But you don't speak down to grown men in front of their community. The captain tried to recover his footing. This ends now, Johnson. You don't own Harlem. Bumpy smiled thinly. No, but I answer to it. For a long second, no one spoke. Windows across the block were filled now, women clutching robes tighter around themselves, men standing just inside doorways, pretending not to stare, but missing nothing, kids frozen mid-step learning a lesson no school would teach them. This wasn't just about one shot. It was about who decided what was acceptable. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, called in by one of the officers who'd broken formation to tend to the wounded man. That sound gave the captain an exit, and he knew it. He raised one hand. Stand down, he said quietly. The words tasted like defeat. Weapons lowered, shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. The bodyguard finally disengaged the safety and tucked the gun back beneath his coat. Bumpy watched the captain carefully. Respect wasn't something you declared. It was something you demonstrated under pressure. You take your men, Bumpy said, and you leave the way you came. The captain hesitated. Pride fought survival in his eyes. Then he nodded. The police loaded the wounded officer into the ambulance. Sirens flared, then faded. Cars rolled away one by one, tires whispering against wet pavement. When the last cruiser turned the corner, Harlem exhaled. Word spread fast, faster than the papers, faster than the radio. By noon, every barbershop and backroom knew what had happened. They repeated it carefully, each time polishing the edges until it became something sharper, something permanent. The police stood down. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. One shot, and the whole precinct backed off. But inside the circles that mattered, the story didn't glorify the gun. It glorified the discipline. The bodyguard wasn't praised for firing. He was respected for knowing when to fire and when to stop. That distinction mattered to Bumpy Johnson. He summoned the man that evening to a quiet apartment overlooking 135th Street. No crowd, no ceremony, just 2 chairs and a bottle of whiskey left untouched between them. "You followed orders," Bumpy said. "Yes, sir." "You fired without panic." "Yes, sir." "You didn't aim to kill." "No, sir." Bumpy studied him for a long moment. "Then you did what was necessary." There was no celebration, no congratulations, just confirmation. But outside that room, the city was already responding. The police department opened an internal review, quietly, carefully. The captain was reassigned within weeks, officially for administrative reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew he'd been sent where his ambition could do less damage. Officers started treating Harlem differently after that. Not kindly, not gently, but cautiously. They announced themselves. They chose their words. They understood that force without context had consequences. That didn't mean the war was over. It meant the rules had changed. The white mob noticed too. Men like Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano had long tolerated Bumpy Johnson as a useful intermediary, a man who kept Harlem profitable without requiring their constant presence. But that morning's events unsettled them. Because violence against police wasn't just bold, it was destabilizing. Meetings were called. Cigars burned low as men argued about risk and control. Some wanted Bumpy reined in. Others argued that any man who could make the police hesitate was a man worth keeping close. Bumpy didn't attend those meetings. He didn't need to. His message had already been delivered. As for the bodyguard, his life changed overnight. He became a name whispered with caution, a figure men studied from the corners of their eyes. Invitations came, threats followed, temptations dangled. He ignored them all. Because loyalty, in Bumpy Johnson's world, wasn't about fear. It was about alignment. And the bodyguard knew exactly where he stood. On the streets, people walked taller for a while, not because they felt untouchable, but because they felt seen. A line had been drawn, and for once it hadn't been erased by silence or paperwork. Harlem had spoken through Bumpy Johnson, and the city had listened. But power never forgets a challenge, and the consequences, good and bad, were only beginning to unfold. Power doesn't strike back immediately. It waits. In the weeks after the shooting, Harlem looked calm on the surface. Patrol cars still cruised the avenues. Numbers houses still opened at dawn. Men still shook hands and exchanged envelopes in back rooms thick with smoke. But beneath it all, the city was recalibrating. The police department didn't retaliate with raids or mass arrests. That would have confirmed weakness. Instead, they began gathering names, routes, habits. They watched who came and went from Bumpy Johnson's orbit, logging times and faces like accountants preparing a long audit. Across town, City Hall made its own quiet inquiries. Not about the shooting itself that had been carefully classified as an officer-involved discharge under active investigation. The real concern was perception. A black man in Harlem had forced police to stand down. That couldn't become precedent. And so the pressure shifted. The first move came through money. Banks that had long turned a blind eye to Harlem accounts suddenly asked questions. Businesses tied loosely to Bumpy found loans delayed, permits stalled, inspections increased. Garbage piled up longer on certain blocks. Streetlights went unrepaired. None of it could be traced to a single order. That was the point. Bumpy noticed immediately. "You don't punch back," he told his lieutenants. "You adjust." He rerouted cash, paid debts early, had attorneys ready before letters arrived. The man had survived decades by understanding that the loudest battles were rarely the most dangerous. But the city wanted something else. They wanted his reach broken. And to do that, they targeted the one man whose action had symbolized defiance. The Bodyguard? It started with a knock. Late evening. Quiet block. 2 detectives standing just outside the light. Polite. Professional. They asked questions about the shooting, about instructions, about Bumpy Johnson. The Bodyguard answered exactly how he'd been trained. I feared for my life. I followed lawful orders. I have nothing further to add. They left without threats. That worried him more than shouting ever could. Within days, old acquaintances resurfaced, a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years, a former commanding officer who suddenly wanted to reconnect. Offers were made carefully, never directly. You don't have to take the fall for someone else. You could make a fresh start. The city remembers cooperation. The Bodyguard reported every word to Bumpy. Bumpy listened without expression. They're testing, he said. They want to know if loyalty cracks under pressure. Does it? The Bodyguard asked. Bumpy met his eyes. Only if it was never real. Then came the warrant, not for the shooting, for something smaller, cleaner, easier to prove, unregistered firearm. The same one used that morning. The city had waited just long enough for public memory to cool. When officers came this time, they didn't posture. They presented paperwork. The Bodyguard didn't resist. He was taken in quietly. And that, more than the gunshot, rattled Harlem. The trial wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to be instructional. The prosecution painted the Bodyguard as a trigger-happy enforcer, a symbol of unchecked street power. They played on fear, on authority, on the idea that order depended on obedience. They never mentioned the word boy. They never mentioned provocation. Bumpy Johnson sat in the gallery every day, not beside the defense, not with an entourage, just present. The judge noticed. So did the jury. Because in Harlem, presence was power. Witnesses hesitated. Officers contradicted themselves under cross-examination. Timelines blurred. The defense didn't argue innocence. They argued necessity. And slowly, the story shifted. From criminal to context, the jury deadlocked. The city hadn't expected that, but power hates ambiguity. So they moved to the next phase. The Bodyguard was offered a deal, reduced charges, time served, protection. All he had to do was testify to clarify who gave the order. He asked one question. Is Bumpy Johnson on trial? The prosecutor paused. Not officially, the Bodyguard nodded. Then neither am I. The deal evaporated. Bumpy visited him in Holding the next morning. No guards present, just 2 men on opposite sides of steel. You don't owe me anything, Bumpy said. The Bodyguard shook his head. I owe the truth. Bumpy studied him. Truth is expensive. So is silence. That was when Bumpy made his move, not with threats, with leverage. Within a week, community leaders began speaking publicly about over-policing. Churches held meetings, letters reached editors, donations to legal defense funds poured in, small bills, many hands. The narrative shifted again. The city wasn't prosecuting a criminal. It was punishing defiance. And Harlem recognized that pattern. Pressure mounted, quietly, respectfully, relentlessly. The charges were reduced further, sentencing delayed, then postponed. Finally, dismissed on a technicality that no one believed was accidental. When the Bodyguard walked free, there were no cheers, just nods. That mattered more. But freedom came with conditions. He was encouraged to seek employment elsewhere, to leave the city, to disappear. Bumpy called him in one last time. You did your part, Bumpy said. Now choose your future. The Bodyguard stood straight. I choose peace, Bumpy nodded. Then take it. He arranged safe passage out of Harlem, a new name, a quiet life. And when the man left, Bumpy watched from the window. Power had been challenged, power had responded, and power had been held accountable. But history wasn't finished with the lesson, because the real legacy of that gunshot wasn't fear, it was restraint. And the city would remember that long after the men involved were gone. History rarely records the moment power learns caution, but Harlem did. Because after the bodyguard walked free and disappeared into anonymity, something fundamental shifted, not just in how authority moved through the neighborhood, but in how it paused. Police still came, raids still happened, arrests were still made. But the bravado was gone. Officers spoke slower, captains chose words with care, and no one used that word again in public. That silence wasn't coincidence, it was consequence. For Bumpy Johnson, the weeks that followed were not celebratory. They were operational. Power, once challenged, doesn't forgive. It adapts. And Bumpy understood that survival at his level depended on anticipation, not reaction. He reduced his public presence, fewer appearances, shorter meetings, messages passed through trusted hands. Not out of fear, but out of discipline, because legends don't cling to the spotlight. They control it. White mob intermediaries reached out first, polite inquiries, concerned tones, subtle reminders of shared interests. Bumpy listened. Then he set boundaries. Harlem would remain Harlem. No new faces, no expanded operations without community consent, no reckless enforcement that drew heat. Some agreed, some resented it, but none challenged him openly. They remembered the morning the police stood still. The real confrontation, though, didn't come from the streets. It came from City Hall. A closed-door meeting was arranged under the guise of community relations. No press, no record, just a handful of officials and one man they pretended not to fear. Bumpy arrived alone, no bodyguards. That alone shifted the room. They spoke in careful language: crime statistics, public safety, mutual interests, cooperation. Bumpy listened until they finished. Then he leaned forward. "You don't need me to control Harlem," he said. "You need me to keep it from exploding." The room went quiet, because they all knew it was true. "You send in men who don't know the people," Bumpy continued. "You get resistance. You send in men who don't respect them. You get blood." One official cleared his throat. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy smiled faintly. "I'm reminding you." That meeting ended without handshakes, but afterward, budgets shifted, assignments changed, policies softened around the edges. Power had acknowledged reality. Years passed. The city moved on, as cities do. New scandals, new leaders, new enemies. But the lesson remained. Young officers were warned quietly. Harlem has its own rules. Politicians spoke of the neighborhood with a touch more care, and men who walked the streets felt something they hadn't before. A line, not a wall, a line. Bumpy Johnson grew older. His limp worsened. His hair grayed. His name, once spoken in whispers, became history, even while he lived. But that morning, the shot, the silence, the stand down, followed him like a shadow. People asked him about it sometimes. He never embellished. "He did his job," Bumpy would say, "and so did I." The bodyguard was never heard from again. Some said he settled in the Midwest. Others claimed he took work overseas. A few insisted he changed his name and lived quietly near water. What mattered wasn't where he went. It was what he represented. Discipline over impulse, loyalty without spectacle, power exercised with restraint. Those were the values Bumpy Johnson had enforced without speeches or slogans, just action. When Bumpy died in 1968, Harlem mourned openly. Not because he was flawless, but because he was consistent. He stood when others bent. He spoke when silence was demanded, and he understood that dignity, once surrendered, was nearly impossible to reclaim. The police sent representatives to the funeral. They stood at the back, hats in hand. That detail didn't make the papers, but the people noticed. History books would later argue about Bumpy Johnson's legacy: criminal, community protector, power broker, symbol. But Harlem didn't argue. Harlem remembered the morning when a bodyguard fired one shot, and the city learned to listen. That moment wasn't about violence. It was about boundaries. And boundaries, once established, tend to outlive the men who draw them. The legend of Bumpy Johnson didn't come from how many men he defeated. It came from how many conflicts he prevented, from how often he chose restraint over chaos, from how he understood that true power wasn't loud, it was undeniable. And that was the lesson the city never forgot. This wasn't just a story about a gunshot on a Harlem street. It was a lesson in how power really works. When Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard fired, he didn't fire to conquer. He fired to draw a line between authority and arrogance, between law and disrespect, between force and control. The city had come to Harlem believing fear would do the job, believing uniforms and titles were enough to command obedience. But what they learned, painfully and publicly, was that authority without respect is fragile. Bumpy Johnson never asked to be a symbol. He never stood on podiums or wrote manifestos. He simply understood something most men in power never do. Dignity is not negotiable. That morning changed how police walked Harlem streets. It changed how officials spoke behind closed doors. And it changed how a community saw itself, not as something to be managed, but something to be acknowledged. The bodyguard vanished into history, unnamed and unseen. But his restraint, his discipline, and his loyalty echoed long after the smoke cleared. Because legends aren't built on noise. They're built on moments when someone knows exactly how far to go, and no further. Bumpy Johnson's legend didn't grow because he challenged authority. It grew because he defined it. This was never about one man's pride or one officer's mistake. It was about a neighborhood demanding to be treated like it mattered. And sometimes history doesn't listen to speeches. Sometimes it listens to silence. And on that Harlem morning, when the city stood still, one thing became clear forever. Respect isn't given by force. It's earned when someone finally stands up and refuses to step back.